Okay, well, maybe I'll start with my introductory comments and as people are coming on. So thank you for all attending our Knowledge and Networking Breakfast webinar series. So hopefully you're having your breakfast or have had a breakfast already and ready to engage. And so today's topic is about communication in the life science sector. And, we were just talking pre-meeting in the green room about how important it's been in this time, but I would argue it's always been important. And when we don't do it exactly right, and we make errors, even unbeknownst to us, it can be really a problem. And so today we're going to talk to some experts in the field who'll give you some indications of things to think about as in this space. As I said, it's always been a really important tool interacting with customers and stakeholders, and the general public has a bigger role than ever to play, as they are more influential in many of our aspects of life science and drug approvals or food or any of the areas that we're interested in. So today we'll discuss how to engage with stakeholders, including the public, how to address some of those topics that might not come out the right way, and how to deliver messages in a meaningful and understandable way. That's often, which is often an issue as well, with perspectives from a variety of different people. So we have speakers from the startup community, from the larger pharmaceutical community through IMC, and also through agriculture. So really looking forward to our session today. I would ask that if you have questions, what we'll do is the speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll moderate some questions after. But please, as you think of the question, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the, you're probably at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and you can just type those in, and I'll try and moderate those questions at the end of each speaker. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and our first speaker today is Elizabeth Monier Williams. Elizabeth and I have known each other for a long time, and she has a lot of experience as in kind of director of marketing and communications for a variety of small startup groups, including innovation hubs. She's also the founder of the Analytic Eye and works as a consultant. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth to take it away. Thanks, Elizabeth.
It's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for having me. So if we can, oh, good. All right. So I think some of the other speakers are going to, if we can go back just one for a second, Brian, to the title screen. Perfect. I think some of the other speakers are going to talk more generally about communications, or more specifically, I should say, communications in the life sciences. I'm going to do sort of the 101 pass, some of the basics as a refresher for those of you who've done them before, or as a brief introduction for those of you who are sort of looking down the barrel of trying to get a strategy right, but haven't done a lot of that work. Hopefully this will sort of help to orient you and help you to think through things with the same lens that your comms and marketing teams likely do. Next slide. So building a strategy, as you know, is all about the thinking and the pre-planning. And the first big question is, what are you trying to accomplish? Often when I work with a small company, it's to launch a product or themselves or both. Sometimes when I'm working with a bigger institution with a longer tail of presence in the market, it'll be to overhaul key messages. It might be to manage a crisis. Perhaps it's to expand existing relationships, to move into a new market, to launch new products. But regardless of what your effort is and what you want the long-term effect to be, the biggest thing is to figure out, why should anyone who isn't you care about this work? And it sounds a little provocation. I think my peers in journalism often ask this, like, why do I care? So what is a question that they'll often ask if you're pitching a story. And if you're a big multinational, it can often seem, because we're X, like, of course you care. But perhaps the market doesn't. People are busy, attention is currency. And I think being really clear about what some of those outcomes are and why other people should be invested in them. The clearer you are in your thinking, the clearer you will be in your messaging. Next slide. One of the things you want to do right off the bat is to figure out who your audiences are. So for startups, usually they run in this order. They need investors to help them get going. They have industry partners to help them prove their product market fit. And often they want government to sort of assist them either through funding or in helping to share and open doors. If I'm in a larger company, again, with that longer tail, I probably start at 4 and 5, and I'd reverse this list. perhaps, although for public companies, investors obviously sit up top, the relationships with reporters, relationships with outside sources, and with patients or the end user of your product becomes much more important when you're sort of a bigger organization. And I think for everyone, especially in the era of the Great Resignation, potential employees and current employees are definitely people you want to think about in your messaging. Next slide. Another key action in a communications strategy build is to do a SWOT. Where is your messaging strong? What are your advantages? What are the assets that you bring to this conversation? Likewise, where are you weak or where do you face threats? Are there new competitors in your space? Are you aware that your website probably isn't the greatest and everybody's kind of embarrassed about it? If that's so, then that's a weakness you would definitely want to address. But as Allison mentioned, there has never been more focus on therapeutics and life sciences, certainly in my lifetime. And so the opportunity that COVID presents to revitalize messaging, to refresh, and to capitalize on the public's understanding of the importance of science and vaccine building is as never before. So that's another opportunity you may see, or the opportunity may be different. Certainly for folks in the agriculture sector, I know we'll be speaking about that a little more. There's so much opportunity related to climate change. What can we do? What can we get right? This is the opportunity to sort of put your whole team together, get aligned on your messaging, and have that build into your strategy. Next slide. Another question that journalist-oriented folks will often ask you is, why now? Why November 18th, 2021? Why not 4 months ago? Why not 6 months from now? Why is now a good time to do this work? Is there a trend, a breakthrough, a key activity, perhaps a response to that, small incidental global experience we've all just had? Thinking through those questions and understanding why there's timeliness helps to build more hooks into your story. And if you're interested in media coverage, you definitely need a strong timeliness hook for a reporter to say, I've got to cover this. This has got to be a priority. Remember always that newsrooms are shrinking, especially in Canada. We've had a huge layoff and reduction in the communications, other end of the communication spectrum with journalists. There's a lot fewer people covering a lot more topics. So if you want to get top of mind and into their mailboxes, you need to be really sharp and crisp with your messaging. Likewise, think through the stakes. Who wins when you win? Who's going to lose out if your company or endeavor is not successful? Thinking through all those implications and making sure you've addressed them and thought through them will help, again, to make your messaging crisper. And as I discovered when I was working at Mars, it's so much easier to tell stories together. When I worked for Mars Innovation, which is now called TIAP, they have 17 institutions. So part of the way we told the story of Mars Innovation was to talk about our members and to talk about their success. And then when it was time to go for funding, it was easier to make a case for the government that, to fund us was to fund all of these other member institutions. That strategy was one that really played off, and it might work for you in whatever circumstance you're looking at. Next slide. Some ideas. So you'll likely have a strategy that works in phases. And here are just some loose thoughts. Number one, you will need key messages. That's not avoidable. You need to have the core of your messaging set forward. I would recommend ideally 3, probably no more than 5. Trying to tell people more things than that, something will fall off the stack. So the more focused you can be, the more intentional you can be, the easier it is for your message to get across. Just from experience, I'm going to guess that there's some sort of thing on your website that you're probably going to want to fix to make sure that it aligns with the new messaging and it's conveying the story you want to say. Is your content up to date? Is your design AODA compliant? That's more for Ontario and Canadian businesses, but right now there's a huge push to have accessibility in web design, and you'd want to make sure that you're up to snuff, because we're getting to the point now where there's going to be fees for people who are not compliant. You'll definitely want to build a funnel or two. So one of the exciting developments in watching the whole Facebook debacle over the last little while and the change to Meta and being hauled before Congress and all of that. The danger in building all of your outreach on a platform like Facebook is that you're taking all your ability to control that interaction and giving it to a tech company that may or may not care to advance you and your interests. And how Facebook lets people see messages has changed drastically since they first launched way back in 2006. So Own your own email list, own your own way to connect with subscribers. Don't build your community on a private island where the rules may change and you might not be able to access it. There are a whole bunch of tools, MailChimp, HubSpot, a variety of others for reaching out and building an email list. Make sure your website and all of your communication is feeding that kind of effort. So the list of people who are going to hear from you is going to get bigger over time. You'll also want to do some growth and experimentation. I know some of the sessions are going to talk about misinformation. One of the things that we've seen happen in the digital space are not wonderful actors buying ads on brand and search terms related to the great work that you and other companies are doing. At a minimum, have a look at what's being bought or who's bidding on words associated with your brand name and make sure that that's not being used for nefarious purposes. It's called a brand defense campaign. People in the growth or ads analytics space could help you with that. At a minimum, I'd say, please be aware that that's a thing that can happen and that competitors or negative actors could be running ads that people who want to hear from you, want to hear from your work, may not see if they're running ads and you're not. The nice thing is that platforms like Google do privilege the if your name, for example, is Life Sciences Ontario and you were sort of bidding for that word, if you can demonstrate that you're the owner of the phrase, it's more likely that you can do some of that bidding, although some of it still is just market rate. But anyway, for your own brand, it's a little easier to own that space, and it's something you should think about. Figure out where your audience is currently doing business. We're in this strange in-between time where some things are opening up and some businesses are returning to life as usual, provided folks are vaccinated, and some folks are still mostly virtual. So where is your audience spending their time? Are they still doing events in person? Are they mostly doing virtual? My guess is for a business audience like this, LinkedIn is your biggest platform and the safest platform to be looking at. But YouTube is the second biggest search engine on the planet, and video content is hugely viral. A lot of private Slack boards exist for specialist communities. I'm on two, one for management leaders, one for growth marketers. And there's 500 or 600 people on that channel and we're all having private conversations all the time. That might be another area to explore. And your employees may be aware of boards and groups and how they're connecting. So polling your people can help you sort of figure that out. TikTok is probably I know people think of it in terms of the weird dances and what the Gen Zs are doing, but there's actually a fair bit of stuff going on TikTok, and it's not a bad idea to just have a look. You could have an employee who has followers and you just don't know. Maybe they're talking about something adjacent to your business, but maybe that means that person has translatable skills. Maybe they'd make a great host for your company meetings. It's worth having a look to see what's out there and what's going on. And then Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook still remain options for this. The last piece I would say is that make sure you're including your people as your ambassadors in this new messaging and new endeavor. Talk to your employees, bring them along for the journey, because their authenticity in telling your story to the people they interact with will do so much more for your brand than, say, an ad buy ever will. Next slide. So you don't want to climb the mountain twice. At the beginning of this process, have a look at what you have. Do an audit of your content. Do you have really great descriptions of your products? Do you have great case studies of achievements that you've made with other industry partners? Can you show return on investment through some of the work that you've done to display to government funders, to investors, why they should invest in you again? Have a deep look through your material. See what you can just refresh. It's a huge amount of work to create the content that supports a business, and as much as possible you should try to recycle and up-rev things that you have from past work. Next slide. So a content timeline. This is a cheat sheet that I use often with startups when they have a sense that they want to do some outreach, but they don't really know how. And having a loose editorial guide will help you sort of map out when are things happening in the business and when are these going to be pieces that people in the outside world would be interested in. So a very short little box like this, you can map the rest of Q4 for this year and the 4 quarters of next year. In general, you'd want to have sort of at least one interesting story. And if you're able to, investing in video, like I said, get your content onto a searchable platform like YouTube. There's some indication that the algorithms favor video content and reward companies that do that, but they change the terms of the algorithm all the time. I can tell you that every time I've made video investments, it's really been worth it. and something that I would help you consider. Certainly with the beauty of platforms like TikTok, while parts of them can be ridiculous, if you're able to find one of the threads or one of the hashtags that's relevant to you, the accessibility of TikTok video, anyone can film it with anything just on a cell phone. You don't need a lot of special equipment, like at most maybe a microphone and a ring light. So there's a lot that video is doing to become more accessible. It's not like it was 20 years ago where 2 minutes of footage was going to cost you 20 grand every time. Certainly doing bigger production, sort of face and interviewing multiple people, you can still be fancy, but you can also do things on a shoestring if need be. Canvas your folks. What other cool, interesting stories do you have that maybe aren't of interest? Oh, I see my connection is unstable. Can somebody confirm you can still hear me? Allison?
I can still hear you, Elizabeth.
Oh, good. I just got the warning light, like your connection is unstable. I'm like, yes. Oh
no. You broke up just for a second, but it's fine. So go ahead.
Oh, good. Thank you. It's just like sharing Wi-Fi with your family. Anyway. So are there other cool sort of stories that partners would be interested in, that customers would be interested in? Can you tell stories to get people excited and invested in the work that you're doing? If you make a key hire, stories about your work culture. What is it like to work for you? Are you a place that resolves conflict equitably and invests in your people? Do you help them advance in their professional career? There's certainly a lot of indication that the benefits of being an employee, especially if you're trying to hire developers. I saw one ad on LinkedIn yesterday. It was a founder out in California. He was looking for a chief technical officer to work with him, and he was offering a $20,000 finder's fee, which is bananas. But that the market is so competitive for people in the technology space, but it's also competitive for people in other areas. Folks are getting really clear about what they want, what they don't. And so if you've got really great things about your business culture that make you a wonderful employer where people thrive and enjoy the experience, that is definitely something I would encourage you to consider telling in the outside world as far as you go. Other things, if you raise a significant round, obviously financial dealings are often of interest to the wider market, especially if you have a huge cadre of investors. If you have media coverage, if your partners talk about you, maybe you've got a close partnership in the manufacturing space and they want to do a story telling about your work together, and that works for both of you as an investment and gives you a piece you can each share. Likewise, if you're nominated for awards, I put the top 40 under 40 here. Industry secret, most PR teams are working to get people on that list. It's not really like the awards committee casts about and it's like, oh, Jeff and Sydney, you've been working so well, we shall award you this award. No, there's a lot of PR pitching going on for that. But if some of that windfall does come your way, by all means, make use of it and tell your community. It's another advantage, and often award stories do quite well. Next slide. In the wild world of digital communications in 2021, there really is no tried and true. A lot of things require experimentation, they require iteration, and a lot of campaigns, email, for example, it's very easy in MailChimp to run a split test. And, you know, if you've got 400 people on your list, it will send to the first 100 and, you know, one message to the first 100, one message to the second 100, whichever one wins will go to the remaining 200. So over time, you'll get a sense of which messages resonate with your audience and what they want to hear from you. And just be open with your folks in your team into doing that kind of experimentation. Not everything you try will work, but you will learn something from it either way. And more importantly, you'll capture data, which will help you make better decisions down the road. Next slide. How will you know you're successful? So this goes back to your goals. What did you want to accomplish? How did you want to and what are you going to measure to know that you are successful? So in the beginning, especially if you haven't done a lot of comms work, there'll be a lot of qualitative feedback like this exists and it's better, or I get what you do now and it's so much clearer than it was. Over time, you'll move more to quantitative feedback. Maybe you get your newsletter established, you're growing at 10% over quarter. Maybe you're able to get even bigger numbers. That's awesome. And it's okay to be basic. Web analytics established with a conversion funnel for your newsletter or social followers. That's great. It's just getting the infrastructure everywhere that people are looking for you so that should you have a big surge in attention, think of it like a flood in a storm. You want to have levees so that the energy of that attention goes somewhere productive so it isn't just overrunning your streets and swamping your people. Yeah, in general, that's really helpful. Next slide.
Elizabeth, I just say another 2 minutes.
Oh, I'm done. I'm right at the end.
Perfect.
Off we go on your journey. Here's where you can find me on Twitter. Like Allison mentioned, I had a blog a long time ago, and Analytica was the handle from it, and it sort of became the calling card of my consultancy. And on LinkedIn, I'm Elizabeth Monier-Williams. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really useful. And I will ask everybody, if you do have questions, again, don't forget to put them in the Q&A, and I'll try and use those questions with everything. So Elizabeth, I'd ask you to stay on so that we can ask you a few questions.
Sure thing.
So one of the questions it was really laid out, wonderful, but the amount of work under there is quite a lot, I would think. So can you comment a little bit about startups where, you know, they don't necessarily have a lot of money, they're trying to invest their money in the research part of it, kind of what the balance is, because if they leave comms till too late, that's going to be bad, but they have to do it. So can you just talk a little bit about the work that's involved and the need for expertise? Oh, you're on mute, Elizabeth.
There we go. Got it. It is a fair bit of work, and I won't lie about that. But the good news is if your senior team is invested in doing that work and you're feeding information to the person who's managing your communications, maybe it's someone on your team who wants to have a hybrid role and is interested in growing, especially if you're small. Maybe if you're part of an accelerator, sometimes there are resources within accelerators, within industry programs who can work with you part-time on a consulting basis, or you can hire a specialist to come in and do that kind of work. In general, it's going to take, 3 to 6 months to really see some sort of difference. It's not overnight. But as you say, a lot of folks don't invest in communications, and then either they've missed the opportunity for the market to know who they are, or something has gone wrong and they rapidly need to tell the market who they are. But I think the more you're willing to look at communications and marketing as an investment in your overall success, obviously I'm biased since that's my discipline, I do think that's a differentiator in how companies achieve success in the long haul.
Yeah, and perhaps it also goes to one of the slides that you said early on about identifying your target audience.
Yes.
So maybe early on you can prioritize based on that list is what I mean.
Yeah, and build up a rapport. I mean, certainly the advantage in business to business is that you're not trying to compete with every multinational for consumer attention, which is a daunting task. And often your audience is very interested in your solution. If for example, let's say you were an accounting software group, like if you look at the rise of Wave and FreshBooks and all of them over the last decade, there certainly are a huge number of clients who don't want to manage their accounting and would like someone else to just come in and make that problem go away so they could focus on their business. If you're able to articulate your value proposition in such a way that the audience and the customer can see how they win with your help and you win together, it's certainly easier than trying to go it alone.
Great. And maybe one more question. I know Carol, just if Carol's online, has a question, and I'm going to leave that question for our next speaker, who perhaps it fits more into their resume. But the other question we got was about communications. As part of the communications, a small startup leans towards Twitter and blast emails as opposed to press releases. So as they grow, how should they evolve their communication strategy?
Sure. So some things like GDPR, which is the privacy protocol coming out of Europe, mean that you can no longer buy and sell email addresses off of lists. And if anyone in your company is doing that, you need to stop them immediately, because not only have those folks not bought into your message, the likelihood that you're sending email will be flagged as a spam account and blacklisted from sites like Google, Outlook, other platforms is very high. So you don't necessarily want to do blast emails. Think of it more as a conversation where you've got links on your website. So if someone's come to see you and they're like, oh, these folks seem interesting, I'd like to hear from them long term, they can subscribe. And then you want to be offering content of value to that audience. And it's really great to think about it in terms of the end user. Like when you're giving a talk, what do the people in the room want to hear? It's about them. It's not about you as the speaker. It's about facilitating that journey. How can your products help them? How can they grow? How can you share their successes? That's information that hopefully the audience audience will be more interested and bought into. If you're interested in talking to government and reporters, Twitter is a must-do because that's still where a lot of those conversations happen. So having a kind of presence there is important. For some of the others, it will really depend on the nuances. If your technology is really visual, there's also still a lot of visual platforms for information sharing where, you know, if you're able to produce really cool proprietary images, getting your name out there that way could also be an option. Sort of depends on what you're up to.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Really appreciate the time. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Conrad Huma, who is from Innovative Medicine Canada. He's the Vice President of Communications and Government Affairs. And he's had a variety of senior positions, communication positions in both industry and associations, as well as communications positions and staff positions within the federal government. Has a very illustrious career if you go on his LinkedIn profile. So I'd like to and thank Conrad. He's actually calling in from France today. So thank you very much. And go ahead, Conrad.
Yes, good morning, Alison. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning. I really appreciate it. Next slide, please. All right, so I currently work for IMC, Innovative Medicines Canada. So we are the national voice of the research pharmaceutical industry. We represent about 100,000 people, 15 billion in GDP, and they invest annually about $2 billion in the Canadian economy. So many of the logos you'll see here, you know, have been front and center through the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So, you know, very much like Elizabeth said, you know, you need to have a plan. You need to start with what exactly is it that the communications function should do. And I've basically broken it down into these three things, right? We help create and support environment for change through communications campaigns, through delivering a value proposition, and finally protecting the business. And you know, I in this role have one target audience, and that is the government of Canada. So I've identified, you know, those 338 elected officials, and then the 1,000 or so staff that support them as my primary target audience. I then have secondary audiences, of course, that are the provinces and others, and we'll get into that. Next slide, please. So when I'm communicating into government, I basically look at it as this wheel. And it feels a little bit like a merry-go-round sometimes, because I'll take you through this journey. Next slide. So it all starts with understanding, you know, what is it that the government wants to do? Where are they headed? What have they announced? Next slide. So in that, there's really three things that you need to start with in your assessment. What do we, and I truly believe these statements in what do you think you know? What do you know that you don't know? And then there's that third bucket of what you don't know, you don't know. These are the things that will emerge as you start to assess the environment and evaluate the environment. So right now, you know, very much like Elizabeth said, what does the government care about? I can very clearly say what their priorities are, but what do they care about? Like that's still a big question, and I would challenge anyone who would say that they truly know what this government cares about. If I think of the Life Sciences Organization and I think about the things that I know I don't know, you know, the government is working towards a Canadian Drug Agency. I know of it. I really don't know what the objective is. And then there's a whole bunch of other things in there. If I think about, you know, Patented Medicine Review Board, for example, do they actually have a financial target? You know, this is something that I don't know. And then there's a whole number of other things, but it all starts with evaluating the environment in which you're communicating. What do you know? What do you don't know? And in here, you can go into polling. You know, you can talk to a whole number of people. You need to read what is being said about the industry, identify potential champions, who's for you, who's against you, who's taken certain positions. Next slide, please. All right, then you move to the second part, which is identifying those opportunities and creating that value proposition. Next slide. So what does that message look like, right? We talk about the win-win scenario. There needs to be a win in it for you, but there also needs to be a win in it for your customer. And in my case, that's the government, right? And if I take, again, one of our major files right now, which is the Patent Medicine Review or PMPRB regulatory changes, I can't simply be asking for those to be stopped and shelved. Where is a common middle ground? Where is it that the government can walk away and say they met their commitment to lowering drug prices, and at the same time, I can report back to my members and saying, it was done in such a way that it hasn't hollowed out the life sciences sector. Then there's this huge issue of fighting myths, half-truth, lies. You need to know what is being said. You need to know who is saying it, and you need to have a game plan as to how, when, and if you're going to respond. Again, a lot of this comes out in your polling of your target audiences, and often you need to respond simply for there to be something on the public record, but to be able to actually have a campaign that can change that perception might not actually be in your best interest. You'll be focusing so much of your time on that that you actually will be forgetting that first goal that you had, right? So if I take, for instance, trying to change the current pricing regulations, I could be spending all my time fighting these myths, these half-truths, and losing my eye on the target of coming to a place where there's that win-win on these regulations. And then it's deciding who has the most credible voice. And this leads into the next part of the presentation. Next slide, please. And that's proactively engaging your stakeholders. Following slide, right? And so I've identified a number of stakeholders: LSO, so provincial life sciences organizations, physicians groups, patient organizations, academics, research centers, clinical trial specialists. These are all part of my ecosystem. And I need to assess with them, where is our common ground on the issue? Are they for my position? Are they against it? Where can we align on our messaging? And aligning the messaging in this case is difficult. We don't want the message to be identical, because then what we're told by government is that these patient groups, these physicians, are in the pocket of industry. And so it's finding that common ground and that call to action, getting those stakeholders to get their voice heard, and coordinating that campaign is a really significant job. Next slide, please. And that's where you talk about increasing the share of voice. And this is really the fun part of it all. Next slide. Right, this is where your stakeholder engagement, your government relations, and your communications, everything that Elizabeth talked about in the previous presentation, all come together, right? If I project over the next 4 weeks, right, we have Parliament that will be resuming next week. We'll have about, well, I say 4 weeks, but really once they get through all the pomp and ceremony of returning the speech from the throne, etc., there's basically about 3 weeks of regular parliamentary business where all of this can come together, and I'll be able to get the attention of members of parliament, the government, the health minister, the minister of innovation, science, Treasury Board, the deputy prime minister, really. So it's bringing all this together, right? So we're meeting with them. We have our stakeholders who have getting their voice heard. We have all of our communications channels going, right? Are we getting op-eds out? Are we in the Twitter sphere being part of the narrative, right? Do we have advertising? Do we have our social media campaigns going on? So all of that, where those all intersect, that's the advocacy campaign. That's when that target audience is getting bombarded with voices from everywhere and realize that they need to do something on this issue. There needs to be some movement on that issue. Next slide, please. And that's where we get to, have we created that environment? Did we create that environment for change, and where there's an opportunity to move forward? Next slide, please. And that's really depicted by this impetus to change. You know, does the government feel that they actually have to do something? Have we been able, you know, to move the needle? It's very, very rare that you'll say, well, I looked at my primary objective and it was to, you know, let's say in this case, stop PMPRB. You know, is that possible, or did I manage to get a delay where there might be further possibility for discussion, negotiation, right? And then, you know, you do the assessment. What is it that the government cares about, right? So it's almost like a rinse and repeat. You get back to the top of that circle, and the merry-go-round starts all over again. So, you know, very, very quickly, it's basically building on absolutely everything Elizabeth said, but the key is really knowing your environment. There's never enough research that you can do. There's never enough understanding of who you're communicating into, and figuring out, what do they care about? Why should they care about what you're saying? And then putting in place all the fun parts of communications, right? Which is building your communications collateral, speaking to your stakeholders, getting them engaged, and then finally having that advocacy campaign. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Conrad. That was really interesting. A couple of questions from me, and I'd encourage other people to put questions in the chat, or in the question and answer section. But I guess one question I had was about election cycles, and this goes a little to the question that was posed around the Ontario government talking about a mask mandate will be removed in March 2022, and whether that was a smart move communication-wise. I don't know if you want to really weigh in on the Ontario government communication strategy around that. That was about patient compliance and messaging. But I think the wider question perhaps is, how do you do your job on a 4-year government communication cycle where what they care about shifts potentially during election and depending. So do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, right now, I could say, you know, a few weeks ago, we did Queen Park Days, and we spoke with, you know, a number of ministers, MPPs. In fact, earlier this week, we spoke to the Premier. And right now, I would say, you know, the door is wide open. They know there's an election in the spring. They want support. So what is it that they can do? So for us right now, and I would say the same for LSO and for Jason, right? The door is wide open for industry to be talking about, you know, a provincial life sciences strategy, and where is the government in launching that life sciences strategy, and encouraging them to do it before they go into an election. If I take a step back and I think about it at a federal level, I would love to have that 4-year cycle, right? Right now, we've been working in minority governments, so it's always, you know, what have you done for me lately? Because the shoe could drop tomorrow. And that creates a completely different environment in which to communicate and in which to do these advocacy campaigns, because they're very much looking for the low-hanging fruit in the quick win. What is it that they can do that they would be able, potentially, if they go back to the polls in 18 to 24 months, which is a possibility, to be able to tell Canadians, right? We have advanced on pharmacare. We've been able to lower prescription drug costs, right? How would they be able to do that? And this is something where in that scenario that we have an opportunity, but in that minority government, the opposition has a very strong voice. And so, it's a matter of working with them with the hopes that, they help you carry your message, and you never know, 24 months from now, the opposition might be the government. And so you've created those ties right across government.
And, it's certainly what you were speaking to was coming from the IMC's perspective, the association perspective, very interesting. Do you think it's particularly different if you're a company, if you're the person working, especially on the government relations side, but even in communications from a company point of view, building on what Elizabeth said, but in terms of the kinds of interactions you would have with the government, perhaps the size of voice is different. But the tactics you talked about, do you see those as being particularly different if you're a single company versus an association?
I think there's a major difference between communicating as a company and then communicating as an association. When you communicate as a company, of course, it's bringing your company reputation, your brand, and whatever you do will be associated with your company. And maybe not the elected officials, but most likely the bureaucrats, will remember, how did you position it? Did you make them look good? Did you make them look bad? So often it's best for the association to take a hard position, because the association, like in my case, I represent 48 research-based pharmaceutical companies. And so I can go and say, on behalf of these companies, we really disagree with what you're doing. Where individually the company might say, I'm not in complete agreement, but I'm trying to work with you because they have a business objective. So there's a slight nuance there in what you can and cannot do, should not do when you're speaking on behalf of a specific company or on behalf of a large number, as I do currently through the association.
Right. And so just because I know Carol is interested in this answer, and I think from your perspective, stepping out of your current role, but having known that you've been in communications in government for a long time, that when Ontario put out this situation that in March we might not need mask, or we're not going to have a mask mandate potentially, I guess the question is, one, does that risk public compliance and public assurance, but also is there a risk from the communications part from the, I've added this to Carol's question, so I apologize, Carol, but also on a communication risk part to the Ontario government about talking about something that clearly is unknown. I think it goes to what don't you know, what, that one question you asked. So is there a risk that way, do you feel, by doing a communication strategy that far out in a pandemic type situation?
Sure. Personally, I think there is. I think it's better to under-promise and over-deliver than it is to over-promise and under-deliver. Right. So right now there's the expectation has been set that masks will be behind us, and that it'll quickly be a thing of the past, and we'll forget and move on. So what happens is, if we get closer to the date and you simply need to continue wearing masks, or you need to wear masks for a much longer period of time, right? So I think there is a risk there. If you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, there were so many things that we didn't know. Where was it coming from? How was it being circulated? And we were reacting to it and adjusting to it. And people were losing credibility very quickly in saying one thing one day and saying, oh, well, we've learned something new. And it wasn't that, you know, that they had lied or misrepresented what they knew. It was simply, it was what they knew at the time. It goes back to, you know, my opening slide of what do I think I know? What do I know I don't know? And then what do I don't know? I don't know. And so, you know, personally, I think that there's a real element of risk having announced it this far out and setting that expectation.
Thank you very much, Conrad. We really appreciate your presentation. It was really quite interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to introduce you to our last speaker today, who's Christina Crowley-Oakley. And Christina is the founder and digital communication strategy behind a wealth-based business, helping brands and leaders be better communicated in the digital space, with particular interest and a number of clients in the ag-food space. And I think life science goes across all areas, and it's important that we learn from each other across the different sectors within life science. So I'm really thrilled today that Christina could join us. So Christina, I'll leave it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And thank you for asking me to be here. I am getting over a little bit of a cold, so hopefully everyone can hear me communicating okay today. Really glad to be a part of this esteemed panel with Elizabeth and Conrad. And most importantly, to be here talking about agriculture. Really glad that the agriculture food conversation is involved and that Life Sciences of Ontario is including the topic. Just go to the next slide if you don't mind. I feel like I could talk about communications as a whole for a whole day, and then agriculture communications and food communications for another whole day. So 15 minutes for me is going to be extremely difficult. What gets me so fired up about communications is how I really do believe it's the most valuable skill that we all possess as human beings, and yet it's the most undervalued skill. You know, it's something that we all do, but just because you can do it doesn't mean you're great at it. And you know, truly, communication and the ability of language is what makes us the top of the food chain. It's what separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So there's a lot of power in that when you step back and you think of why we're even here today having a conversation about communications. But I'm really glad we're having it. You know, I always say too that communications, it's storytelling, it's emotion, it's psychology, neuroscience, biology, sales, all in a matter of words or visuals, like Elizabeth talked about. There's a lot of power in that. You know, you can have the best idea, the best policy, but if you can't communicate it, if you can't articulate it, you truly have nothing. And so, you know, when I think back to my days, I've worked in corporate world, public sector, not-for-profit communications. I previously worked for our Minister of Agriculture here for the province as his press secretary and director of comms. And we always talked about how you can work on policy all the time, but if you can't communicate it at the end, and we always put communications kind of at the end, and that was something we were really good at, was saying, how can we position this communications and talking about this policy at the beginning while we're developing the public policy that we were working there. Next slide, please. You know, I think oh, we'll have to go back the other. There we go. I think the whole reason why we need to be having a communications conversation, and I'm really glad that I kind of ended this webinar today, because we can use agriculture and food as an example of why communications is extremely significant in the times we're living through, and why it just seems to be that everyone's talking about communications. You know, communications, we have to make sure we remember that it's about feeling, that the science, it supports that we can't make communications science-based. It's not about facts and figures, it's about feelings and emotions. And if we're able to understand that in the way that we develop our communication strategies, in the way that we understand our target audiences, in the way that we do two-way communicate and listen to our audience, then we will be better at creating public policy. We will be better at executing whatever ideas, products, services that we want to offer to someone to buy, because that's essentially what communications is all about, is two-way impartment of an idea or something that you want to exchange with someone else. And so from this slide, what I want to leave with is that, you know, a lot of us spend a lot of time in today's day and age because of social media and digital media all the opportunity that surrounds it, but we spend a lot of time in a reactive state. And what I would love to see a lot of our organizations, and doing what I try to do with a lot of the clients I work with, is how can we position ourselves to be in a proactive state of communication a lot more of the time than we are reacting, which is a lot of what we do. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, agriculture and food could be a case study in itself about communications and the challenges that we face, but I also see as a huge opportunity for us. And Elizabeth mentioned, climate change is a perfect example of how consumers and Canadians are talking so much about climate change. I think right now, as a personal example, I'm a dairy farmer's daughter over here. What is happening in BC right now with the mudslides, the water, we have a number of very close family friends who are dairy farmers in the Abbotsford area, and watching through social media, I'm getting goosebumps talking about this, but watching what they're living through in real time, in that our good friends, they sent their wives and their children away while they stayed and got their cows out, their livestock. You're seeing, I'm sure, those scenes and videos on the news and on Twitter and TikTok as well. It's powerful to see this. And so this is a time that we can take these challenges as a sector, as an example, and really propel them, to use them as an opportunity to bring value to what we're doing. I actually appreciate the fact that consumers are caring about their food. They are asking questions. They're engaged. Some in the agriculture and food sector may be very, they may get very, very personal about why they're being asked these questions. Why are you challenging me, my lifestyle, my livelihood? I understand we're all very biased in what we do. We all get a bit self-defensive when we're working so hard on what we are, and that's created a lot of these challenges that I've mentioned. But I see them as opportunities. Next slide, please. And for me, when I'm working with our agriculture and food clients, these are I could go and talk about all the opportunities, but I always land on these 5, that we always are going to have an engaged audience, consumers. We have the time right now, let's capitalize on it. And a lot of these opportunities can speak, I'm sure, to you and your organizations and businesses on the line today. As well, what is great for me to see, there's a Canadian Centre for Food Integrity has a public trust report, and it was just launched a month ago. And it was wonderful to see the results, that Canadians are very assured in our food system. The pandemic recently proved that for them, that they were continue to eat, our supply chains were not interrupted in the disastrous ways they could have been. And so Canadians believe in their food system. So the facts and figures are there to support this opportunity to talk. We have the platforms, digital media, social media, video. Elizabeth had a great point there about video as well. Overproduced video now makes people very skeptical. They don't trust it in the same way. They want the personal, the relatable. They want the person, holding the phone, watching them in real time in their dirty clothes, their work clothes, if you will, from an agricultural standpoint. So, that type of relatability on platforms that we have, you can't put a price tag to that, and the value that you can get out of that. For us in agriculture and food, we'll always be in business. There's so much power in saying that. Consumers will always need to eat. Canadians will always need to eat. The way we maybe choose to eat may be different, but at least we always will have a target audience to speak to. And for me, what I see the most value in the opportunity is our people. We have the best people doing what we're doing, as all of your organizations do. We're ambassadors for our sectors, for the line of work we do. We need to capitalize on that more, and we need to be telling more of these stories rather than worrying about policies. It's faces, it's people, it's emotions, it's the feelings that speak to the brain that are going to get people to listen to how we communicate and understand the value of our sector or our organizations. Next slide, please. So I'm going to leave you here with 3 takeaways, and I love that my previous speakers on the panel today talked about tactical, because I'm all for execution, and that's a lot of what I do in my business. It's strategy, but it's also the execution part, and sometimes we do a little bit too much of one or the other. What I am going to talk about today, and in the 3 things I want to leave with you, is some strategy ideas to step back. Most importantly, have this conversation within your organization or for your sector about what my previous speakers talked about, but also this big picture of who you are, why know why you're doing what you're doing, the values to which you're doing it. That is what is going to be able to keep your communications, business plan, strategy, all of your key messaging. That's how you're going to be able to craft your narrative. If you keep in mind where you want to go, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. Next slide, please. These are some of the words, and I think they're extremely relevant to all of you on the call today. And when I'm talking to agriculture and food, of how we need to convey our why and that value, that communications value of our sector. These are the words that people, that Canadians, that consumers want to hear when they're being communicated to in today's day and age. Transparency, trust, simplicity. A lot of what we talk about in our life science sectors are very complex problems, challenges, policies. We have to be able to speak to them in simple language, simple feeling. We have to capitalize on the times that we're living in, the things that consumers and Canadians are talking about. And most importantly, back to the idea of big picture thinking, mindset shifts. How can we work with people to communicate what we want to with them? Next slide, please. Number two, before our last point, is develop two-way relationships with people before you need them. So just like Conrad had mentioned about meeting with the Premier and government well before they need his organization and he would need them, that is how you develop good communications well before needing people to show up for a webinar or come to an event. You have to be able to network well in advance before you actually need something from someone, because they will smell it out. Absolutely. Next slide. One of the ways that I wanted to say about developing this, and this was from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity's Public Trust Report back in 2015 when it first started. In order to build that type of trust, we have to find shared values with those people. So people will never believe you. They'll never believe the facts and figures until they trust you with something that they find in common with you. So as an example, for me, food is something that we all have in common. The weather is something we all have in common. Find that thing that connects you to those people. Maybe it's nothing work related. That is what is going to develop those two-way relationships with people, again, well before you need them and before they need you. Next slide.
Christina, just say 2 minutes.
Okay, perfect, Alison. So lastly, ask and listen. I thought this was really powerful from what Elizabeth and Conrad spoke to, but this is where your answers will lie. Be honest with listening to people, remove your biases, remove what you have towards what you work on and what you're doing. The people, your target audiences, they will tell you what they want to hear from you, how they want to see things from you. It's you who is going to have to be ready. That's the most important part of communications, is actually listening, not the talking part. Last slide. What I feel for communications as I wrap up here is there's a lot of power in communications, and we simply don't give communications the power that it deserves. In understanding that a quote like this, if you let someone else write your story, you're letting them write your history, that's quite profound. And so we have to be able to position ourselves to take back the narrative, know how to use all the pieces that Elizabeth talked about, that Conrad talked about, and to also step back and know what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, and most importantly, how can we be better communicators in what we're trying to talk about and what we're all trying to say, share, sell, convey. That's the power of communications, and it's something that agriculture and food is well aware of. That is our challenge, and most importantly, excited to see what we do with it to communicate that value. So, Alison, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Christina. And I think the comment you made about agriculture can be an example of all of this is really important. I have one question to ask, because I know we're getting very close to time, and you already dealt with trust. And so one of the questions that came in was, how do you build trust with the public and government through communications? And I think you've talked about that in your presentation. So I'm just going to tweak that question a bit, to apologize, Jason, to say, how do you regain trust? So you've built trust, but then sometimes it gets lost, and then that's a more difficult, I would say. But could you comment on that?
That's a really, really great question. And I think that's where I dare to say, use the word vulnerability. When you have to say sorry, I have to say, when I see a leader or a CEO or a business come out and apologize for something, if you do feel that you were in the wrong, if a number of people have told you, your stakeholders, your audiences, that you're wrong, being vulnerable in that way is probably the most incredible communication strategy as an individual, as a human being, right? Saying sorry. So if you need to, by all means, be sure to say sorry when you need to. Regaining trust, I feel like we could talk about this, a whole session on this, because then you have to ask yourself, did they really trust you at the beginning? If you've lost their trust and you can't regain it back. And then there's a whole set of communication strategies that you'd have to ask yourself, are we positioning ourselves in the right way to really get that person's trust back? So again, I'm sorry that that's a bit of a vague answer. I know that we're short of time, but the public trust conversation in sciences, in life sciences, in agriculture in particular, it's a conversation that we're seeing government too. It's not going away, and if anything, it's just going to become more profound, I think.
So I really appreciate that, Christina. I think that was actually a great, fulsome answer. I want to thank our speakers. I mean, it was really fascinating to me, and I particularly want to thank them for providing concrete ideas and things for people to think about. So I think hopefully people have taken away some tools, as well as just listened to some experts giving you really good advice. And I'm going to pass it on to Jason now to close out the webinar.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks again to all of our fantastic speakers today. We've had we've known Elizabeth for a very long time. She's actually our first communications, dedicated communications person at LSO, although she was part-time between us and Mars Innovation, but really set us on the path. So Elizabeth, thank you for all the work that you've done for us in past, and continue to be part of our organization. And Conrad, IMC has been such a fantastic partner. Conrad talked about, LSO's efforts on PNPRB, but I wanted to really call out IMC's efforts in terms of promoting one of our main advocacy issues, which is the need for an Ontario life sciences strategy. They have been fantastic partners and champions for that in all of their communications. And I don't think we say it enough, but thank you, Conrad, for all that you do. And Christina, this is the first time that we've met, but our organization, LSO, is committed to expanding our efforts within the agri-food sector. So some of the things you talked about today, we're really taking to heart. It's been very helpful, and I'm sure we're going to be in touch with you again as we continue those efforts. So thank you for being a part of our conversation today. A few quick announcements. LSO award nominations are open. The deadline is December 17th. We're planning to go back into person next year, where our awards event is going to be in May. So assuming that all things go well, we'll hopefully be able to convene and see each other and celebrate in person at that event. So please do submit your nominations for the awards. You don't have to submit for every award. You can submit for individual awards. So if there's a person, an individual, or an organization that you think is a great fit, please go on our website and you can submit those nominations. We have an upcoming event on November 24th in partnership with Seneca Center for Innovation in Life Sciences, and this is entitled Solving Industry Challenges Through Research and Development Partnerships. Please join us for that webinar. And we will be closing out the year with our final webinar on December 16th. This is part of our member marathon series, where we invite some of our newer members and maybe some of our older members to present what's happening within their organizations. So please join us again for that on December 16th. And finally, tremendous thanks to all of our sponsors, our platinum sponsors shown here. Of course, our gold sponsors and our silver sponsors. Without our corporate sponsors, we would not be able to do any of the events, these ones included. And so we really appreciate all of their support throughout the year. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for sticking around for the final wrap up, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care and have a great day.